Hi, I'm Steve Plage, and I'll be your host for this evening's program on Voices from the Village. Tonight we'll be discussing our national prison system, prison reform, the prison industrial complex, and the movement to abolish the prison system altogether, led by the local activist group Sin Barras. A number of questions are raised on the face of any discussion concerning our national prison system. Among these questions are, why our country imprisons a greater percentage of its citizens than any country in the world? Why Black Americans, who comprise 12% of the population, compose 40% of all prison populations? Why 65% of all those incarcerated are nonviolent drug offenders? We'll also be asking why our county jail medical care is being outsourced without local accountability, while at the same time our state prison system is under a federal court order to reduce the population because of medical care found to be cruel and unusual. Given the institutional problems that continue to plague our prison system and the national attitude that views incarceration as an effective social policy, the question of whether it is even possible to repair a system so poorly constructed is both fair and appropriate. I'm pleased to have with me tonight 3 community members and activists who are at the forefront of this discussion on these issues. It's my pleasure to welcome Tash Wynn and Courtney Hansen of Sin Barras, and Adriana Mee from the Inside Out Writing Project. As we usually do, we went out on the street this week and asked the people of Santa Cruz what they thought about prison overcrowding, and this is what they had to say.
This is Voices from the Village. We're in downtown Santa Cruz and we're asking people, what do you think we should do about the overcrowding in California's prisons?
I'll let all the drug offenses out and put the violent offenders in. That's what I would do.
I think the legalization of marijuana for recreational use would probably be the biggest simple one thing that could be done.
We have all these things for the prisoners, like 3 square meals and then healthcare, all that stuff. So we're wasting our own money for them. So I think for overcrowding, maybe convert some of that into, I guess after maybe more, like build more prisons, maybe that. But at the same time, it's just making a bit more of a problem. So
places where people can go into rehab, where they don't have to spend a fortune, where we have shelter, where we have places that actually can tend to dealing with people who have a lot of problems, who get free counseling then, so that we address things at the root rather than we're dealing with the surface. It's like putting a Band-Aid on to a huge cancer.
Yeah, I think we could let everybody that's in there for dealing a few bags of pot, let them out. That'd get rid of a lot of that problem. And there's a lot of other just, sort of nonviolent crime, that people have been stuck in there under the streets, 3 strikes you're out thing that are ridiculous. There's a guy that got put away for life for stealing a slice of pizza. That actually happened. I'm not making that up. And that's, BS, if you can say that on community television.
Myself and other individuals that have been incarcerated for good amounts of time, we're all under the impression that if instead of locking us in a place where we're basically just going to be going to school to learn how to be better criminals, to be involved in programs that help us learn new life skills or better ourselves as people. Another thing that would really help is counseling and basically making it easier to talk to your family.
Stop arresting as many people, and then there'll be less people in prison. So, maybe we need to ask why we're arresting people and if these people are actually a threat to our society, or maybe a large majority of them are simply people who are using harmless substances that are classified as dangerous drugs by the federal government. And that's really the majority of people ending up in our prisons are these drug offenders that, maybe some of them need help, maybe some of them are just doing something that's really harmless to them and to society, and they're getting locked up for it.
That's what people had to say today in Santa Cruz. Back to you in the studio.
The people of Santa Cruz are both knowledgeable and opinionated. I'll remind our viewers that this is a live call-in show, so you can reach us and any of the panelists at 425-8844. You know, my good friend and local activist Paul Gershowitz, whose birthday it is today, tells me that the revolution will not be televised. I think we are going to put that notion to the test this evening. Adriana, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in these issues that we're talking about this evening.
Okay. First off, I just want to mention that I am a recovering drug addict. That is a lot of my main influence for being very vocal in prison issues, considering a lot of people who are incarcerated are drug offenders, and I do not believe that they should be incarcerated. I moved to Santa Cruz about 3 years ago to get sober and had the opportunity to attend the community college here. Took some sociology classes and just ate it up. I was so hungry and just needed that knowledge. And now I believe that it's my duty and my obligation to give that back and to keep working in the community. So.
Okay. And you make an excellent point. As I mentioned in the intro, roughly 65% of all prisoners in our prisons are nonviolent drug offenders, and they're simply being warehoused there. Courtney, tell us a little bit about yourself and your involvement with the prison issues and kind of how you got started with this.
Yeah, my introduction to social justice was actually coming to the university and getting involved in the student movement against fee hikes and the budget cuts. And my involvement with prison abolition happened because I was arrested at a demonstration and then at a second one a year later. But it was that experience, that very short stay in jail, that made me come out and sort of not only rethink the existence of prisons, but the connections between that and education and all social services and economic and social issues. So I came out of it thinking, wow, who would I ever want to send there? No matter what they did or what I was trying to fix, what would better the situation would never be to put them in that very violent place.
And I know we were talking before the show began about being incarcerated and what a profound and disempowering experience that can be, and something surely that no one should be subjected to. Tash Wynn, you give us a little background about yourself and your involvement with that.
My involvement with Sin Barras originally began kind of at the same time as Courtney. We were both arrested at a political demonstration. I've been arrested several times after, but at this particular one, I was isolated because I identified as a queer person, so I didn't get a phone call, I didn't get any water, I was never checked on, there was no windows, and I was only there overnight, but I realized that this is not how I felt. Terrible for being a queer person. I felt very shameful, and I also felt incredibly ashamed for advocating for public education, advocating for things that we all deserve. So I was very confused and perplexed afterwards, and there was a debriefing meeting afterwards where all of those who were arrested for that demonstration gathered, and that's kind of where abolition and community building and community organizing, that was the seed for me.
And of course, one of the things that has given rise to our discussion and the concerns that we have is really the development of this prison industrial complex. And that's something that's very real in our society today. Tash, will stay with you. How does Sin Barras view that, and what are you doing in terms of addressing the rise of this incredibly large and powerful prison industrial complex?
Yeah, well, what we mainly do is we try to seek out connections with those who have been incarcerated, those who have been impacted, so children of parents who have been incarcerated. We have several members in Sin Barras who haven't been inside but have felt the effects of what it's like being in a broken family. Also those who are on the line of getting funneled into the prison system because they were poor, they're houseless, they have nowhere to stay, those who are addicted to drugs. So we try to find the common thread, and we gather all of these experiences, which in itself is a form of resistance, and it builds community because now we're all supporting one another, right?
And Courtney, I've heard you speak at several of the rallies and events, and particularly about that the prison industrial complex really doesn't solve any social or economic problems. Can you speak a little more to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one thing that people point out a lot is that the majority of people who are incarcerated for victimless or nonviolent crimes. So if we look at the context of people's lives and the reasons why they're committing crimes, rather than thinking through this binary of us and them, there's good people and there's bad people. If we just put the bad people away, the good people will be safe. And we look at why people are committing crimes. A lot of it has to do with survival, whether that's feeding their kids, feeding themselves, like making their payments on their house or whatever it is. And look at kind of the root problems in the context of people's everyday lives, then we wouldn't be having to funnel people into the prison system. And we would look to different solutions. It would really open up a lot of doors. So we could be funding drug treatment. We can ensure that people have food security and housing security, rather than thinking we need to build a new jail because there's just more and more criminals.
And Adriana, your thoughts about the prison industrial complex generally, and maybe how it impacts people who are challenged by drug addiction or challenged by alcoholism or challenged by mental health issues?
Well, I think one of the best things that I'm able to do and one of the places that I'm able to come from is I get to see the prison industrial complex very directly. Unlike a lot of people, I work for an organization called the Inside Out Writing Project, and we go into the jail. We have one men's unit and one women's unit, and we facilitate writing workshops with them. The idea is to bring their work out into the community, to blur those lines between inside and outside. So I get to see that. I get to go in and spend quality time with these people who have become very much my family. And I am able to see that most of these, I work with the men now, most of the men know each other from foster care. They know each other from the juvenile system. They've been in and out of the institution since they were, their parents were incarcerated. So I get to have this very direct view of what the prison industrial complex is. And it's cold and it's damaging. And I hear accounts of people who get out who have been so institutionalized that they can't function on the outside.
And I know that as we talk about addressing the problem from the outside in a social context and doing what we can with our activism to improve conditions generally as a social construct, there are actually people inside, people who are incarcerated. And those are the people who really need our support. Those are the people who are suffering this kind of privation day to day, that those of us who are trying to reform or abolish the system really, I don't think, can comprehend with as much depth as we might like to. One of the things we were talking about earlier in terms of funneling people into the system, and we're talking about surveillance does that, race does that, certainly the new Jim Crow, will maybe get a chance to talk about that later. But I was mentioning that there's a group called Vftv, the Community Initiative to Visit Immigrants in Confinement, evidently because of secure communities, and we won't really touch on that tonight because it really isn't on the topic we have here, but because of so many people that are arrested through secure communities and held for detention in lieu of deportation, there are estimated to be 400,000 immigrants across the United States who are sequestered in these various jails and prisons, and that is something that I think needs to be brought to much more light. Let's switch a little bit on a topic and talk about the war on drugs, which really is an inimical part, really, of this whole discussion. Tash, tell us a little bit about your view of the war on drugs and how you think that it relates to prison reform, prison abolition, prison reform of any kind.
Definitely. We can begin looking at this on a local level in Santa Cruz and in what has happened in the last year, and also what we see that is very visible. a lot of people inside Santa Cruz County Jail are in for drugs. And in the last year and a half, the Santa Cruz County Board of Supervisors voted to replace the medical treatment center with a private contracted out group out of Monterey Bay, actually, called California Forensics Medical Group. This saved money, and they also had the enticing item for why the Board of Supervisors voted to contract this group is because they had something called the detoxification program that they called. After investigating what this detoxification program is, we don't really know what it is. The only difference between being placed in a detox program and in Santa Cruz County Jail is that you get checked on every now and then. But since last August, we know that 5 people have died in Santa Cruz County Jail, 4 of which have been inside that detoxification program. So this local example is very telling. It means prisons and jails are not rehabilitative centers. This program doesn't work, and that why don't we put money into drug treatment centers outside of cages that don't break people? Let's expand our homeless services network and also refine it and put a lot of energy into that so that it is efficient and it does provide support and enough care.
And Courtney, your observations about the war on drugs and how it's impacting the prisons and incarceration and just our society in general, really?
Yeah, well, I would like to go off what Tash said and say
Please.
let's dream big, and in the here and now, what we have to do is fund more homeless services. But can we also imagine a world where we don't need services for the homeless, because there aren't any homeless people, because we live in a very wealthy nation and world. But because of how that wealth is distributed, we have an increasing amount of homeless. So I think part of the work that we do and part of abolition is kind of not being afraid to dream bigger than that. While of course we have to look at concrete steps of what we can do here and now, because I think that homelessness relates very much to poverty, relates very much to drugs, relates very much to why people find themselves in situations where they have to sell drugs to survive.
And of course, in Santa Cruz County, we have roughly 2,700 people that are homeless without shelter every night, 1,000 in the city of Santa Cruz, and they are suffering, as they say, the privations of not only poverty but drug addiction and the challenges that we as a society, I think, really should address. Tash, you were going to say something on that?
Yeah, I also think that it's very important to prevent drug use and this is kind of where abolition comes from, right? So if we are going to eliminate prisons, before we even start thinking about that, we need to incorporate abolition into our everyday, and that means making connections, support single mothers, support all different types of family, provide child care everywhere, all of the time, so that those of us who are struggling to survive or go insane don't have to turn to drugs, and their children don't have to turn to drugs. So I think creating really open and organic networks every day is very important, in addition to supporting these services and, providing programs.
And Adriana, you were mentioning earlier about your work with Barrios Unidos, and I know they do a lot of work within the system and a lot of supportive work. And tell us something about that, if you would.
Well, one of the things that I love about Barrios Unidos is that they provide services that are based upon spiritual principles and also cultural awareness and being tied to your roots. And that's one great thing about prison abolition for me, is that you're able to see a person as this whole being and this whole thing. And BU is very good at that, is recognizing someone's history, someone's culture, and providing them an outlet for some sort of academia. They have a prison correspondence program where people who are incarcerated all over nationally are able to write in and request academic information, legal resources, spiritual advice, all of these different things, artwork. And that, again, that's prison abolition, right? That's treating someone as this whole being with a past, a present, and a future, and all of that in between.
And it's interesting that as we go through past, present, and future administrations in the California governorship, they create policies that, well, we're going to just put people away because society just doesn't want to see its offenders anymore. No, this time we're going to rehabilitate them so they won't be recidivist. And so it's just back and forth, and by the time you get any traction on one new policy, then a new administration comes in and rescinds that policy and starts another one. I mentioned in my introduction the stats that I used about 40% of the prison population being African American, and they comprise 12% of the American population. That is from, as you know, a movie called The House I Live In, which talks about the war on drugs and how the war on drugs and the prison industrial complex kind of have fed one another. And that's kind of where we are in terms of that. And it really has, in my opinion, and really it's your opinions as panelists that matters to me more, frankly, but I will tell you that I believe that's created a new Jim Crow, where I think that it has shackled and held down an entirely new generation of black Americans. And the only thing we can do is shift the paradigm from, 2/3 of the money we spend on enforcement and a third on rehabilitation, shift that around. Shift that around to 2/3 for support and rehabilitation and a third on enforcement. I think we will be making some progress in that respect. Do you have any thoughts about that, Tash?
On switching the...
Yeah, the paradigm.
Yeah, definitely. It's like I said before, that is exactly what abolition is all about. It's about preventing. It's about, we may not even need law enforcement. We can be very accountable and caring towards one another. And the war on drugs to me is kind of like the war on poverty. It's like this mask behind racism and sexism and genderism. It takes all of the isms and norms and literally makes people disappear. It also is the reason behind a lot of this war on immigration and what's happening with this, the way in which the media spouts all of this very skewed information about, the war on drugs in Mexico and how we have to tighten our borders and detain those who don't have documents for indefinite amount of time, right? And it's also the driving force behind why it's okay for us to build more prisons, why it's okay for there to be a labor force in prisons, right? And that same thing is the same reason why we see the women's population in California growing the fastest.
Yeah. Courtney, your thoughts about the really very rapid growth of female incarcerees?
Yeah, I think that I try to bring up women, and not only women, but transgendered people every time I talk about prisons, because we tend to not always think of them as related issues. People might talk about violence against women or sexual and gender violence, and then they talk about prison issues as if they're separate. So women are the fastest growing prison population. And what was do you remember the statistic you recently gave?
It was almost 600% in the last, I think it was 20 to 25 years. But you have the most overcrowded women's prison in Chowchilla, California, just 3 hours east of here. And it's almost 200% capacity.
Yeah, and I think when we think about prisoners, it's kind of male is the norm. That's kind of who we picture in our head. It's the first that we talk about. And when that really becomes a problem for me is that when we're talking about agency and resistance that prisoners are capable of and exercise every day, even while living in cages, we don't really think about women. And this is where a kind of view of the feminine as being passive and docile plays right into the prison industrial complex. So I think it's really important to look at those stories of women and also look at why are so many women ending up in prison. If women are in there for violent crimes, which most of them aren't, but I do think it's important to look at violent crimes too, is because of defending themselves against a batterer or abusive partner.
Well, let's talk about prisoners for a minute. I know that you and Simbaras have been very much involved with the hunger strikes going on across the prison system for better conditions and trying to abolish solitary confinement and things, these really dehumanizing things that have happened. And locally there have been some jail inmates who have been involved with this. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the California prison hunger strikes resumed. This wasn't the first one. These have happened many times. Resumed on July 8th with 30,000 prisoners all across the state. And what we heard from someone who had just gotten out of the county jail here in Santa Cruz a couple weeks ago was that 37 prisoners inside of the jail right down the street had joined the hunger strike. And with their own sort of spin on it or their own demands, because different jails have different kind of primary problems. And of course, if you talk to the administration about this, they'll tell you that's not happening because they don't want people outside and know that that's happening and to question the jail. But we had heard that from someone who had just gotten out.
And I'll remind our viewers that it is a call-in show, so if you have a question for Tash or Courtney or Adriana, it's 425-8844. Adriana, your thoughts about what's happening locally inside our jails and whether or not they are aware of and supportive of the hunger strikes that are going on?
I know that they're aware of it. A couple weeks ago, I did an Assata Shakur teach-in with the men, and we talked a bit about the hunger strike. That was during also the Trayvon Martin ruling. So we had some conversation about that. But generally, I don't like to. There's some things that I just don't like to press often unless they bring it up. I think that the community that I've built, or that we've built, that we've all worked to build inside of the jail with one another. Is a lot more emotionally based than that, and it's a lot more, there's more vulnerability and there's more of an escape from this reality, right? And so sometimes things like whether or not they're participating in the hunger strike or what their thoughts on that are, sometimes it's like a null point, that what we're doing is so important also.
And I know that there are 5 main points, I guess, in the statewide hunger strike. Can you give us information about that?
So the first one, there's 5 core demands, and this is what they've been pushing for all along. And in 2011, when they first went on hunger strike for these 5 demands, after months and months of this ongoing hunger strike, the California Department of Corrections, I won't even say rehabilitation because that doesn't happen.
All right.
Actually,
tell it like it is.
Actually admitted that these were perfectly reasonable demands and that they would, I think this is important background, that they would implement real reform. And when they didn't, a year later, this is when the prisoners resumed their hunger strike. So the first one is to end group punishment. The prisoners are punished by the pods, the areas that they are in, and they're also punished by race, which is really hard for some people to believe. But I've heard of, a family member driving all the way to the California-Oregon border to visit their loved one and being told that the black people don't have visits today, they're on lockdown. So they want to be held individually accountable for their actions. The second is to end long-term solitary confinement. They're kept in windowless cells for 23 hours a day, sometimes for decades. The third is adequate food. The fourth is to abolish the debriefing policy and modify gang status criteria. The reason inmates end up in these SHU units, security housing units, is because they're validated as gang members. We could talk about that and what gang member means to the CDC. And the last is to provide constructive programming for inmates who are sent there indefinitely, so they don't know when they're going to get out. They have no education, no sort of programs to engage in life in a meaningful way.
And I know that Simbaras has been particularly active recently in some events and rallies. We've got a short clip we're going to play of a march and rally that ended up at the county jail with some speakers. So let's take a look at that and give you kind of the flavor of what Simbaras is doing out in the streets where it really counts.
Secure communities is part of this whole prison complex. because now they're locking up people that have done very little or almost anything. They're locking people up for traffic offenses. The secure communities were supposed to be only for dangerous criminals, people that already had a violent record or people that already had those tendencies. So the people that are locked up now sometimes have nothing at all to do with any kind of crime. They've been locked up for traffic offenses, been locked up for just minor, very minor offenses, and then they get turned over to the Department of Homeland Security. Like I said, I used to be in the Black Panther Party, and one of our points in our 10-point program was to release African American and Latino people from prison and get them tried by people of their peers, not tried by all white juries, not tried by people that are upper middle class, not tried by people of their peers, people that look like them, sound like them, act like them, and have the same socioeconomic problems.
So it came clear eventually that my mom was in jail. She was in LA County jail. When I went to visit her, she had pink eye because they wouldn't give her gloves to work in the laundry and they wouldn't give women enough tampons. So her hands would be covered in other women's blood and she got sick. So when I went to see her, I sat on the floor while my grandmother spoke to her through the glass. I didn't want to see her. I still kind of hate myself for that. While I was lying in bed crying myself to sleep into my pillows every night, she was laying on a cold bed without a blanket with the lights on because they were trying to keep them awake. She told me recently that she was at yoga and they made her stand in a certain position, and it reminded her, it gave her a flashback of this time when every 3 hours at night they would wake the women up and make them stand for an hour. Torture. It is torture. It's sleep deprivation and it's torture.
I have been fortunate enough to be able to join you in several of these events, and they're wonderful. I don't know how that band can find the wind to march all over town and play just as strongly from the first to the last. Just incredible. The website we want to put up for Simbaras. The website, you give it to us?
www.sinbaras. It means without prison bars.
Indeed.
.wordpress.com.
Okay,
so
great.
sinbaras.wordpress.
Let's spell it. Let's be real.
Right.
SINBARAS.wordpress.com.
We want to make sure we get that information out because this is a group that is doing things, that is out in the streets. I'm a street person, and for me, I just have to be out in the street, and make sure that people understand that there are things that we really need to talk about and really need to address. Mm-hmm. And it's not simply from a flyer or a video or something like that. And that's why I do admire and respect the work that Simbaras is doing, because they're putting their feet out in the street where their feelings are. So. Tash, we're talking a little bit about the hunger strike generally. Give us a little bit more information about that.
Yeah, so this hunger strike began and it was led by those in solitary confinement, but it was also a really great opportunity for those outside of California so there are prisoners in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, in Arizona that are not eating in support of the California prisoner hunger strike. There are also prisoners in county jails. For example, I want to use this time to celebrate an incredible victory In Contra Costa County, prisoners went on strike. They wanted their demands have to do with adequate food, better programming, more opportunities to write with those inside. Very much a lot of demands that are important to that jail itself and that are in line with a lot of problems that are systemic in our incarcerating system. So it works. Hunger strikes work. And it's also very important for us on the outside to call Jerry Brown every single day, to look into our sheriff's department and see, is our sheriff's department planning on expanding our prisons, or are they working towards better improving it, right? So are they building more jail beds, or are they, practicing restorative justice?
And my experience actually has been, and we were talking about this earlier, that our community corrections partnership is really enlightened in that respect, that they are providing some initiatives and some programs that really help people inside to be able to transition to the outside and to stay outside, rather than some other counties. We were talking about this earlier as well. The AB 109 money is allocated by a committee in Sacramento, and that committee gives the most money to the counties that have the most prisoners, simply. And there's no oversight on that. They can use the money for whatever they want. Now, a lot of counties are just building more prison cells. Santa Cruz County is not. So we can be at least encouraged to a certain extent by that, and I hope that they will continue that policy as we move forward. And you did mention restorative justice. Adriana, you were talking about that. Tell us a little bit about restorative justice.
Gladly. Restorative justice is a great alternative to incarceration, and it's been proven to work in many, many different cases. What it is it ends up being a victim-centered sort of approach, where it ends up being, instead of what law was broken, what harm was done, and where was it done, and how can it be restored. By no means is it a thing of forgiveness, because that places a lot of weight on the victim. But what it definitely does, it allows communication, it allows community building, it allows a lot more than just locking people away and leaving the victim kind of out in the cold. And I think what it also does is it treats everyone who's also incarcerated as victims too. Because I find, especially, we talked about women a little bit, and I want to throw it out there again that women who are incarcerated need to be paid attention to. A lot of them are victims of sexual violence and sexual abuse and domestic abuse. So they need to be treated as victims of trauma also. Right. And so restorative justice allows us to do that. It allows us to give value to communities that we create, so that when rules are broken, people feel personally responsible instead of feeling left out and closed off from this, and isolated. Right.
And your observations about restorative justice, Courtney?
Yeah, I mean, going on that note of sort of fostering a community of accountability, which to me, the police and prisons are very normalized for us because of shows like Law and Order and shows like Cops and Tough on Crime Politicians. But for me, it's kind of crazy when you think about it. If someone does something wrong or someone inflicts harm onto another person, which has ripple effects to the whole community, we just take that person and rip them away from the community and completely disappear them. And another way that we could rethink justice is, what if we address that person in the context of their community and what they've done wrong, and rather than put them in the most violent environment you could possibly imagine, kind of collectively address what they did, why they did it, how they're going to regain their accountability with the community, and what that looks like.
Right. And you were mentioning the hunger strike and those who have been sympathetic to that. Our good friend Jen Laskin sent out a message on Facebook, said that she had been fasting for the hunger strike, and it's a great supporter of these kind of causes. And it occurred to me when you were talking about ripping people out of their community and stuff, it starts when you're young. When you have this direct file system, which we have in California, where youth, juveniles, can be tried in adult courts. And they are tried by means of identifying them as gang members, as members of some other undesirable group that must be separated from society. So direct files, you're starting these people young, and why are we doing that? You have any observations about direct files, Tash, at all?
Definitely. I mean, I think this is when we study and when we look at, you don't even have to study it. You can see it in all public school systems across locally and across the nation. We see schools shutting down everywhere. We see education dropping as students. I feel like I'm paying more for less, while I see the prison system and surveillance increasing. There are more cops on the streets more than ever. So now we not just have adults that live in fear, but we have students and children and youth who live in fear when they go to school, which is supposed to be an empowering institution that betters the community. It's actually breaking it when we allow oppression to kind of flow through education as well. And it comes home with these kids, right?
Well, and SCORE just recently, and Jen Laskin was really the person who got this done. We had 2 screenings of Juvies, and this Juvies, as you know, was a film that was made by 5 juveniles while they're incarcerated in the Los Angeles County Juvenile Hall, who were all being tried as adults. And what SCORE did with Juvies and what Jen did, was say, well, we need to do more than just show this film. We need to have a Santa Cruz community support group along with that. And that's exactly what you did. So what we're talking about in creating a supportive system, is really what we need to do. And then, we can talk about answer the hard questions, talk about the hard issues.
I think what's really important is that, like, as we organize and as we seek community involvement and engagement, we have to do it in a non-hierarchical way that includes.
You're talking about Occupy Santa Cruz?
Exactly. It's multi-generational. It includes youth, and it also studies the way in which a lot of activist groups are led by youth, right? We have to let those who have been impacted by the prison, impacted by oppression, people who are struggling to survive, they are the leaders of this movement of every age. And that's how it sustains, and that's how we have to allow it to flourish and grow.
Courtney, your observations about that?
About which part? That was
about this, about the juvenile part of it, the juvies, the need for support, and that, before they get to the point where they're adult offenders.
Yeah, I mean, I think that looking at it through the lens of gang validation is really important and useful, because we can look at gang injunctions that are happening in communities of color and how that already sort of sets people up on this track to likely end up in prison. And the way I think about it is the high school I went to looks like a community college. But I have friends that went to a high school where they go through metal detectors every day, and they don't have a counselor, they have a security guard and cops. So what internalized oppression does that create? And it further normalizes the prison system. And in the context of the hunger strikes, the folks who are being gang validated, many of them are activists, whether they were imprisoned for political action or they organized once inside. So people who read novels by George Jackson, or even, it's just very racialized, even people who speak Spanish in their letters. The gang investigators are taught that that's a sign of gang activity. So we really need to break down those sort of labels and that sort of language.
And again, going back to SCORE, Sarah Emmert did a presentation to the Board of Education about direct files. She does a lot of work with the Law Enforcement and Education Action Group, which in turn does a lot of work with Barrios Unidos. And so I know Barrios is really engaged at that level, with juvenile offenders.
Yeah. We work a lot, and right now at BU I've been looking a lot of racial and ethnic disparity collaborative tables that have been successfully implemented in different counties nationally. And what that are, it's a bunch of stakeholders who get together and they oversee all the decisions made in juvenile court. And they are able to decide and have some sort of say in, okay, is this racially biased? Is this discriminatory? But furthermore, let me just say too, working in the jail, I was able to meet someone who was charged life without parole when they were 16 years old. And I was able to talk with them, and I was able to get a sense of how dark that is. And because of gang enhancements, their case was not able to be reviewed. Because just last summer, that was determined to be unconstitutional. You can no longer charge a minor with life without parole, but his case would never be reviewed again. So it happens, and I think it's something that we don't consider often about these. These are kids, but it starts early. It starts with children of incarcerated families. I like to use the analogy of you have two children who are exactly the same in every way. And one of their parents dies of cancer, and the other child, their parent, goes off to prison for the rest of their life. The children whose parent dies of cancer, the community circles around them and supports them and loves them. But this child whose parents are incarcerated, they're isolated, and they're immediately put into the system, destined to almost fail.
So, and this is from the lens of our side of the table. What's happening on the other side of the table? What kind of reaction are we getting from state and local prison and jail officials? Are you getting any kind of engagement, any kind of sense that they are interested in listening to the arguments that are being made, the causes that are being put forward?
We have a lot that's happening legislatively. We have the governor that refuses to even accept that there's a hunger strike occurring in his own state, where 30,000 people, one that 30,000 people are involved in. We have also giant pots of money that are supposed to solve overcrowding. This is called AB 109. And we also have federal judges that have, that are scorning Jerry Brown to solve overcrowding so that he can provide adequate medical care. But what is happening, we see some jails, several jails in certain counties using that money to better their programs. And we see many, like Run right here in Redwood City, building a brand new jail. Monterey, building another brand new jail. San Francisco, their jail is called the Hall of Justice. I like to call it the Hall of Injustice. They're going to tear it down. They're going to tear it down and build 800 more beds. And once you have more beds, you're going to fill them. But we also have legislation, a lot of support that's going through the state and assembly right now to tomorrow, stopping in Sacramento to stop sterilizing women, to end tubal ligations at women facilities. We have a lot of work that are happening with students on ending the school to prison pipeline, right? And we have there's a lot of legislation led by Tom Amiano, who's a state representative, to reduce racial discrimination, to better conditions of those inside. So there's a lot of things, and you just have to look it up, and you can also you don't have to, you can find them on our website, actually.
And how about, Courtney, how about Phil Wowak or Mike Carter, any of the people associated with our local jail? Are you getting any kind of engagement, any kind of cooperation of any kind from them? Or are they just sitting back and saying, well, we've got the power and you're going to have to try to do something about that?
Well, we haven't been able to have much communication with them yet, but there's so much work to be done, and we've kind of gone through some phases of shifting gears. So what we were initially focusing on these past few months was just making visible that we have a jail down the street, that people are dying in it, because that in and of itself is like something you have to kind of shake people, especially in Santa Cruz, injustice is happening right here. And I think being in the streets, like you said, is something we really wanted to be doing, and working on the community level and not just speaking with officials and kind of trying to push them, though that is really important work. But we wanted to be a grassroots group that's kind of out in the streets, able to do that without restriction.
That's really one of the things that I have appreciated about Symboris. Not only is it a younger demographic that's really leading the charge on this, and you'll see in Santa Cruz, if you've been around, and I haven't been around for 100 years like some folks, but there are a lot of progressives in town who are in their 50s and 60s, who are still just as committed and still just as enthusiastic about the work that needs to be done, but don't have the energy to see that commitment through. And not only do you have the younger demographic and that energy, but you have a plan. You're talking about, well, we have work to do. That's you don't often hear that in organizations that are extremely passionate or they're very, very focused on one particular issue. They said, well, we have work to do before we can reach this point. And I think that really bodes well for the success of Symboris itself. I've always thought that it's so important to have people in the streets, to have people aware that you're doing these things. And as we saw in the clip, and as you've done many times before, you're there, to let people know that this is happening. You are planning more of these kinds of events. You're pushing forward with this kind of a plan.
Yeah, and one of the things that's we're really excited about right now is that we have a public meeting space. We live in a world where it's very difficult to secure any sort of public space where we can come together as a collective. Believe it or not, that's something we could do. So we finally got a spot for that. So even that, a lot of labor went into finding a space and negotiating. We're cooking a monthly meal for houseless folks in exchange for this space. So just securing that so we can get together weekly was a big milestone that we're
And I
happy
think
about.
It's striking to me that someone has been around town and watched kind of very esoteric points of view being expressed, that you really have a holistic approach. We started this evening by talking about, well, it's not just about prisons, it's about homelessness, it's about poverty, it's about race. That's the kind of thing. I think that's the kind of a broader conversation that you can really get somewhere with. Adriana, do you do any work with the Friends Outside and those folks? Do they even have a chapter here in Santa Cruz County that you're aware of?
They do have a chapter. However, if you're a part of a group that goes into the jail, you can only choose one. You can only go in with one group. I've tried before to go in with Barrios Unidos and was declined entrance again with them. So Friends Outside does have a chapter in Santa Cruz, and there are a variety of ways you can get involved with them. Also, there are ways that you can get involved with us. I want to throw just a plug in for my Inside Out, our blog spot really quick. It's insideoutwritingproject.blogspot.com, all one word. And you can find all of the writings that we get out of the jail. And you can also find our email, and you can get involved that way.
Yeah. So as we look into the future, what is our future as a country that imprisons a greater percentage of the population than any in the world? What is our future when we are really binding and shackling a whole new generation of Black Americans? Is there some way out of this? Is there something that we can look to and say, if we follow this approach, this plan, if we make these requests or these demands and this action, is there hope to move down the road to where we have prison reform or prison abolition, in your opinion?
Definitely. I don't think this is something that's going to happen overnight, and I don't think that there is one linear answer to justice.
Right.
I think that it's very important to not reinvent the wheel, because so many people, so many organizations, so many families are doing a lot, and it's very important to support one another by going to each other's events, by going to their meetings, bringing ideas, right, to make connections, make allegiances, kind of dissolve the notion that there is an us and them. Right. Talk to those who work in law enforcement as well. It must be an incredibly traumatizing job to strike fear in the souls of many wherever you go, just by wearing your suits. So I think it's very
better to strike hope, in the minds of many, if
exactly.
you can.
So I think that it begins there. It begins also supporting non-reformist reforms legislatively, taking the streets, making connections with those inside, forming allegiances, talking to your, the guy who bags your groceries about what's going on. Talk to your neighbor, go to a political movie screening together, or talk about it over brunch. There are so many different things that we can do every day.
And Courtney, what does your crystal ball tell you about the future?
Oh man. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that there's one answer, and I think what I want to really push through people is to really not be afraid to call for abolition, just like people called for the abolition of slavery, because like Tash said, it's not going to happen overnight, but if we have a long-term vision of abolition, that informs our decisions here and now, and it informs how picky we need to be about our non-reformist reforms and what battles we are going to take legislatively.
And it really struck me when I was struggling for a title for this night's show. And I knew it was going to be about prison system. We talked about this through the Facebook and whatnot. But I said, it's got to be about, is it reform? Can it be reformed, or should it be abolished? And I think that's the question that we have discussed tonight. And I think it's something that people can take from the show and say, you know what, I never really thought about the possibility of what the world would be like if we abolished the prison system. What is that world? Vision that world for yourself. And if you can see the possibility of that, then work for that possibility. Adriana, you have Adriana? You have
okay.
Adriana, go ahead.
I just want to close it off with this for myself, is that prison abolition is not hard. It's simple. It can be simple if you allow it to be. And I don't believe that it will start politically, and I don't believe that it will start economically. I believe what needs to take place is this conscious shift, right? In seeing everything as a whole, and seeing everything as being interconnected. It's not just education over here, healthcare over here, housing over here, prisons over here, right? There's this web, and they're all together, just as we are all together. And what happens to you affects me, whether or not directly.
And I think we're just beginning, I think, to appreciate that kind of holistic political activism approach, and it really is what's so refreshing, I think, about Symbaris, and what really has drawn me to your work and what you've done is that is truly the path that you're following. And I think you are. I see you showing up at all the other political events, and I go to all of them, frankly. But nevertheless, I see you showing up to those things, and that is very important. It's very reassuring to the people who are there to know that you're supporting them, and they in turn will certainly support you, because I hear people talk about nothing else in terms of prison reform is what's Symbaris doing, how can we help them, how can we get involved, and you've certainly given us an idea of the depth of your passion and your work, and I think the progress that you will make in the future. Listen, thank you so much for being here, Tash Wynn, Courtney Hanson, Adriana, me, appreciate it. This has been wonderful. And for Charlie Phillips, our producer, and for all the engineers, I've been Steve Plage. Thank you for joining us on this evening's Voices from the Village.